Catherine Lambrecht. As I mentioned, this is a program from the Illinois Humanities, so hello and welcome. Thank you for attending this Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholars Speakers Bureau event. Illinois Humanities, a statewide nonprofit organization that activates the humanities through free public programs, grants, and educational opportunities that spark conversation, foster reflection, build community, and strengthen civic engagement for everyone in Illinois. Their traveling speakers program, the Illinois.
So tonight we'll start with a few definitions of terms. I have tried in my reporting to be respectful of their families and their heritage. Gypsy, yes. So it's not a term used by the families themselves, but it comes from Egypt or Egyptian, because when the families moved into Europe, that's where the Europeans thought they had come from, was from Egypt. So Rom is the name typically used to describe themselves, and it actually comes from an Old Indian word dam, which means man. And so Roma is the plural of Rom. So as I just mentioned, the term gypsy originated from Western Europeans who believed the families came from Egypt. The Romani language has proven to be the key to tracing the roots of those families as they picked up words along their travels. And it can be traced back to the 10th century in India. They migrated through northern India, through the Middle East, and into Europe by the 1300s. Ancestors of the Gypsies of Europe left India for a variety of reasons. Some to serve the rich courts of the Persian and Arab dynasties in the Middle East, while others were brought as captives or slaves. A third, smaller nomadic group found their way back to India was cut off by conflict and war. Romani families have faced prejudice and hardships for centuries. They left India by 1192 when the Battle of Touraine was fought and headed to the Middle East. But they were on the move again in 1347 when the Black Death reached Constantinople. By the 1400s, Gypsies were reported in many European countries, from Italy to Switzerland, including Germany, Spain, France, and Holland. It's 1514 before they're first mentioned in English records. Just a few years later, in 1530, the expulsion of all Gypsies was ordered from England. In 1554, a death penalty was introduced, giving them just 30 days to leave the country. The 1500s through 1700s continued this trend with various laws passed against the families. They weren't allowed to travel or camp. It was illegal to wear their ethnic clothing. By the 1800s, things were starting to improve, with immigration restrictions easing across Europe and the emancipation of Gypsy slaves. The 1850s saw immigration to the United States from England for many Gypsy families, including the Coopers, who were a big part of our Central Illinois traveling group. Earlier migrations had brought Gypsy families to South America and Canada. But why did they face these prejudices? And when they first immigrated to Europe, they were farm workers, blacksmiths, and soldiers, as well as musicians, fortune tellers, and entertainers. This made them an interesting diversion to the bleak everyday life of the time period. But they soon drew the attention of three powerful forces: the state, the church, and the guilds. The state wanted them to settle down and pay taxes. The church was concerned about the heresy of fortune telling. And the guilds were sort of like the labor unions of the time, and they didn't like the fact that these families were mobile and they could produce their goods on the go and reach the customers, and the whole family could be involved in producing their goods all the time. So many Romani families began immigrating from England in the 1850s. They were led in 1854 by Levi Stanley and 26 members of the Stanley, Harrison, and Cooper families, who ranged in age from infant to elderly. Life was changing drastically in England in the 1850s. Factories could now produce goods much faster and cheaper than the families could by hand. Public lands were being converted to agricultural lands, and so there wasn't room for them to camp anymore. So they arrived on July 1st in New York City on a ship named the Try. And this is an actual painting of the ship and a copy of the ship's manifest that lists all of those families when they traveled. They had departed from Glasgow, Scotland, and although many of the families were wealthy enough to travel in better circumstances, they all made the voyage below decks in steerage. but oral histories passed down through the family said that they baked some golden coins into loaves of bread and sewed it into the hems of their skirts so that they could bring some wealth over without it being noticed. Levi Stanley's mother and father, Owen and Harriet Stanley, arrived in 1856 with additional family members. These families were all closely related to the Coopers, who are spent time in my hometown and have fascinating histories of their own. In the United States, the traveling families continued their lifestyle. They traveled in large wagons, similar to modern-day campers. They would travel from place to place, typically having a similar path each spring and each fall in the north, and then they would head south for the winters. They made their way trading horses and telling fortunes. We're going to take a look at several Romani families with ties to central Illinois, and we'll start with the Stanleys. The Stanley family, which Stanley Avenue in Dayton, Ohio is named after, amassed about 6,000 acres in the Dayton area and owned a stately mansion there for years. They're often reported to be the largest and one of the wealthiest families in England. Harriet survived only a little more than a year after her arrival in America, while Owen lived just a few years longer and passed in 1860 in his wagon outside Hanover, Indiana, leaving behind, we're back. 12 children, 40 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Kings Avenue in Dayton is also named for the family. Shortly after setting foot on U.S. soil, Owen and Harriet found themselves in Ohio's Miami Valley. Owen, the king of his family, proclaimed the area as their home. And this was really unusual. When they were in Europe, they didn't have a home base. All they did was travel. And he wanted his family to have a home where they could rest in the winter, restock their livestock. So he invested in land, built a home there, and like I said, they spent every winter there. So after King Owen's death, the property was sold at a public sale at the courthouse. And I'm not really sure why, if it was a tax sale or what it was, but this is one of my favorite stories that I found in my research. They were selling the mansion and the 6,000 acres at a tax sale on the courthouse steps. And one of Owen's daughters shows up in 1860, I think it's about 1864, in all of her gypsy regalia, her big gold earrings, her flowy skirt, her scarves, and she outbid every single man trying to buy that property. And she was able to keep that property in the family for several more generations. And it makes me think of Scarlett O'Hara. I just picture it very grand, and I love that. The families often used waterways and rivers to move wagons and livestock. Although their home base was in Dayton, just north of Cincinnati, the Stanleys always stopped in Cincinnati each spring to have their wagons repaired, and then they headed down the river. And it just gave them a little jump start on their journey each year. So the Stanleys didn't only have a home in Dayton where they lived, they also established a home cemetery. And this was really unusual, the first time that had really happened. And so it's at Woodland Cemetery in Dayton, and it is reported to be the first common burial ground for a Romani family. The first burial was Harriet in 1857, and they've documented burials as recent as 1999 for a direct relative and 2018 for a great-great-granddaughter-in-law. And I just think that's incredible. They've all been brought home to be buried there together. So this screen just says Harrison. The Harrison family is another big gypsy family that came to America. Elizabeth Stanley Harrison was a sister to Levi, the daughter of Owen and Harriet that we just talked about, and she married Isaac Harrison. The Harrisons were another prominent family that often married with the Coopers that we'll talk about in a little bit. The two families traveled together for a time, but a newspaper reported in the later 1800s the families were no longer traveling together, but did not specify why. Falling outs were not uncommon amongst the groups, and I think we can imagine traveling with your in-laws living in wagons all the time, going from place to place. It would be a little difficult. So the Harrisons established their base in Evansville, Indiana. And again, it was right there on the Ohio River. So they spent the winters in the South and then returned to Evansville each spring. Newspapers report they always had their wagons repaired and repainted in Evansville before heading out on their annual travels. Similar to the Cooper family in Marshall that I know, and the Stanleys in Dayton, the Harrisons returned their family members to Evansville for burial for decades. Harrison family members are laid to rest at Evansville Oak Hill Cemetery, and again includes several generations. My husband and I actually took a trip to Evansville one weekend to photograph the cemetery, and it is just a big, beautiful cemetery in the middle of their town. So Isaac's death is quite tragic, and newspaper accounts vary, but the best that I can piece together, in the spring of 1901, two of Isaac's sons got into a fight. Some of the newspapers say it was over a horse. Some say it was because Isaac favored one over the other. But whatever was going on, the boys were fighting and Isaac stepped between them to break it up. And the younger son, Harry, fired a gun and it killed Isaac. And they were in Alabama, but they brought him back up to Evansville to be buried. So Harry fled and was thought to have gone to South America, but in reality, he never left the United States. He was injured in a railroad accident out west about a year after shooting his father, and on his deathbed confessed who he was and what he had done. And so in the meantime, Isaac's estate was being settled in the court at Evansville. And there was inheritance for each of his children, including Harry, because he didn't expect there to be drama over that. And so the court tried to disperse Harry's part of the inheritance to his brothers and sisters. No one would touch it. They said, that's blood money. We want nothing to do with that. You just keep it. So the court didn't know what to do with it. There's a newspaper article where there was a young girl from New Jersey who wrote to the clerk of the court at Evansville and said, I'm not related to this family. I have nothing to do with them. But if you need someone to take that money, I would be more than happy to go ahead and claim this inheritance. So this is a good time to talk about Gypsy royalty, because in funeral notices, Isaac Harrison is always referred to as the Gypsy Queen's consort or the Queen's husband. She was a queen, but he was not a king. So Gypsy royalty was not inherited, as we think of with the monarchies in England. They were often voted. And I'll tell a story here in a little bit of a funeral home director in my town who actually presided over one of the elections to elect a new Gypsy king and queen. The Joles family, Joles, was another well-known and well-traveled Romani family that had connections to all of these other families in Illinois. They often traveled US Route 50. So from St. Louis to like Lawrenceville, Illinois, in central southern Illinois. And they established their home base in Salem, Illinois. So their cemetery is East Lawn Cemetery, and it is one of the neatest places I've been. If anyone's ever that far south and you have a chance, it really is incredible.
Is this Salem like
near Mount Vernon?
Salem?
Right, no, further south. It's not far from Mount Vernon, where you were just out for your presentation.
Okay.
So Sam Joles, known throughout the area as Gypsy Sam, was the patriarch of that family, and he was born in Somersetshire, England in 1852. The family had a young daughter buried in the cemetery, and it's been a while since I've read the story, but I think it was when they were in town for her burial that a second daughter passed away, so they buried her there, and then Gypsy Sam's father died, so they brought him back and buried him there, and the same thing, it began generations of returning families to this little town in central Illinois to be buried. One of the neatest stones is for Gypsy Sam's grandson and his wife, Mozella and Charles Ray Broadway. And their stone, there's a cross in the middle here, you can't really see, but it is probably 6 or 8 feet tall. And then there's their individual stones on each side. And across there are 2 flat stones laid across their graves. And one tells the story of how they met. When they were children, their families just happened to be at the same funeral. And they met as little kids, and then they met later and married and had a family of their own. And for many, many years, the families would come back and visit every Memorial Day. And they would work with a local florist to make these incredible, amazing floral things. Like one year, it was actually at Thanksgiving time, and they had an entire Thanksgiving banquet created out of flowers that they laid out on the grave. One time it was a 4-foot tall Pepsi can because one of them liked to drink Pepsi. They said at one time it was a skull can. So just anything related to the family liked. Gypsy Sam had this poem composed, and it was published in a newspaper in 1897. It reads, upon the hill lives Gypsy Sam, as happy as a stork, with Betsy, gentle as a lamb, on the banks of Skillet Fork. So Sam just wanted to be accepted, and Salem really did, I think, accept him. They have a cemetery walk every year, and they always feature a member of his family, but he donated money to the town to build a subdivision off to the side of town, and he also built a small little white wood frame church that sits just off the highway. It's really sweet. It's still standing, and it is still an active church today. In the mid-1970s, there was a carriage museum outside of Findlay, just outside Shelbyville, Illinois, and it was this amazing collection. They had things like World War I ambulances, and they had some horse-drawn hearses and some really neat stuff. And I found an article that talked about a gypsy wagon that was owned by Gypsy Sam that was in their collection. And the museum only lasted about 4 years, and then the collection was auctioned off. And the newspaper accounts talk about how it drew foreign bidders from all across the world to bid on this really unique collection. And so I haven't tracked down Gypsy Sam's wagon yet, but it is at the top of my to-do list. I'd love to know someday where his wagon wound up. So that brings us to the Coopers. And Matt and Miranda Cooper were both born in England in the late 1840s. And I'm not sure when they immigrated to the US, but would guess the late 1850s or early 1860s when all of the other families were coming over. Matt's immigration year is listed on later census records as 1859 and 1868, so there is a discrepancy in those records. The first record I found for them was in Evansville, where they were married in June of 1875. And the 1900 census, Matt and Miranda are with their children, Oliver, William, Sylvia, Stanley, and Bessie, in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, which is the farthest north and east that I was ever able to locate them. And Matt is listed as a horse dealer. The family traveled by wagon throughout the Midwest and spent a lot of time in Illinois. In the 1910 census, they're actually in Jasper County, Illinois. And it's kind of interesting because they're listed on a supplemental page where they were camping at the local fairgrounds. And they're listed as transient. And their family is much larger now. They have all sorts of in-laws and grandchildren traveling with them as well. Hattie Reynolds Harrison was the wife of Valley, a son of Isaac Harrison who was murdered. And Hattie was the oldest daughter of the Coopers. And she was first married to a man named Shanty Reynolds, who I have not been able to find any information on. He just, I know that he was the father of her daughter. And then that was it. So this is just a little snapshot of one corner of their family tree. And it shows that Hattie was married to Valley Harrison, and Valley had been married before to Macy Stanley. So there you have all of those families that we've been talking about, the Stanleys, the Harrisons, and the Coopers. Valley and his first wife, Macy, had 2 children, daughters named Lulu and Belle Mary. And then Hattie and Valley had 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Well, Valley's daughter, Lulu, married another man named Valley Harrison, who I have no idea where he came from. He's not related to them. His name is the same as her father, but there's no connection between them. And then when Lulu passed away, this younger Valley then married Emma Harrison, Lulu's half-sister. And so it's just complicated. They're not inappropriate relationships or anything, just very complicated to try to trace the families. And here is a photo taken of the Coopers at their summer camp in Arkansas. So these are some newspaper clippings showing different visits of the Gypsies here in Illinois. The first record I found of them in my area in Marshall was from 1873. And the newspaper complimented the quality of the travelers' horses. And then there were also reports all through the 1880s and 1890s. This is one of my favorites. It was from 1901 and says, since the gypsy fortune teller visited us, some of our young blood strut around like a bantam in his first crowing in glorious anticipation of the bright future in store for them. Best stick to the old trade, boys. So they'd had their fortunes told and thought they had all of these great things coming because of what their fortunes had told. So our little town down in Marshall is only about 3,500 people. It's not big like Dayton or Evansville, but the Cooper family felt so welcomed there that when their young daughter Louise died in 1894, they wanted her buried there. And they didn't buy just one plot, they bought an entire 8-lot section. And so they continued to send family members back until 1968. So over 70 years that they had family sent. And this is a list that actually shows, when I started my research, we knew of about 6 family members buried there, and we identified about 20. There's the big red stone I talked about at the beginning that we all knew, and that was Matt and Miranda, and their children are buried around them. But there's actually 2 more lots in our local cemetery. There's another lot that has more of their children. And then at the far other end of the cemetery up front by the road is sort of the in-laws and grandchildren. And this is such a cool photo. The family would come and visit, and this was a picture of the family. I mean, they're all dressed out in their Sunday best, picnicking near the patriarch and matriarch stone. And then this one shows those burials. So I know you guys can't see, but the main burials up top here in the middle of the cemetery, and then the in-laws and grandchildren are kind of down here. And it's Matt and Miranda and all of their children that are buried around them. And most of their children, so Matt was elected as a Gypsy King, but Miranda was not a queen. It's another situation where he was elected, but she was not. But most of their children served as king or queen of their tribe at one time. And the newspapers would report that the Gypsy Queen of all the United States had passed away. Well, it really wasn't like that. They were queen or king of their family. There wasn't one ruler for the entire United States. It was more they were the head of their family, really, is more what it equated to. Grandchildren. There was one stone that really, really had me perplexed. Her name was Capitola Jones, and she was the wife of Matt and Miranda's grandson. And her obituary in our local paper in 1931 said that she had died in Belle Plains, Iowa on May 22nd. She was buried there May 24th, but then her body was nearly immediately exhumed and brought to Marshall and reburied in June. And so when I did a little research, what I found on her death certificate was that Capitola had died of tuberculosis. And Belle Plains, Iowa was a revolutionary sanatorium community to treat tuberculosis patients. It was very self-sustaining. They had a dairy, they had factories where they sewed, not really factories, but they sewed their own clothes. Anything they could do to take care of themselves, they would do. So I think with a tuberculosis patient, they probably just wanted to bury her as quickly as they could. And then when the family found out, they said, no, we really want her brought down here with us. And so they brought her all the way down to Marshall. So the big story in our area is our Gypsy Queen. Her name was Queen Morella. And she was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1878. And she's a bit of a mystery. The only record I can find of her husband is in her obituary. And she was only 34 when she died. And it said that he had died 15 years earlier. So she would have just been 19 years old when her husband died. So I assume his last name was Jones. That was the name that she was buried under. But they did have a son. His name was Saki. And Morella died in Rector, Arkansas in March of 1913. And her father brought her body back home to Marshall to be buried. And it caused quite a stir. There were notices in the newspaper. There were about 3,000 local residents. And like I said, today our town is 3,500. So to have 3,000 people travel to our little church to see her funeral was a big deal. There were reports from little towns all over the surrounding counties where people were motoring up to visit the Gypsy Queen's funeral. And they were sorely disappointed because it was a very somber, very normal ceremony with just her close family there. So it was something like 30 relatives and 3,000 area people come to see it. And she had died in March, and her father brought her body back to Marshall on the train, but they needed to get word out to the family to travel back. And so they actually had to send her body to another nearby town where it could be kept on ice until they could bury her in June. So our local legend tells that one of the queens of the Cooper family placed a blessing on our town that prevents the city from ever being affected by a tornado. And there's a few different versions of it. Some of them say that it's just because she's buried there that we have this blessing. There's one story that says there was an arrow-shaped stone placed outside of town, and that stone is said to split any tornado that comes, and it'll go around the town. And so when you have a legend or folklore like that, it's really hard, often to find the base of it. But I was doing some other research one day and found a newspaper article from 1917, just a couple of years after Queen Morella had passed away. And it tells about a tornado that came through town, but it stayed just north of town. And so it didn't really touch our town, but it did take down the tower at the railroad station. And the Gypsies would have camped just on the other side of the railroad station is the cemetery. So the Gypsies were camped there, and a tree fell on a tent that had 3 family members in it, 2 young women and a man, and not a one of them had a scratch on it, on any of them. So I always wonder, was it a local townsperson who said, gee, Queen Morella was watching out for them, or was it a member of the family who kind of started that rumor?
It's very interesting. It's very
And this is a picture I threw in just because it's so neat. This would have actually been a little bit later in the 1930s. Marshall was home to a civilian conservation corps camp. But this at the front of it would have been the railroad station. And then the Gypsies, they would have been camped right in this area. And then the cemetery is just out of the frame of the picture. And then this is our train station. And I just throw it in because I love that picture.
Does that train station still look that way?
The train station is gone. It was torn down, I think, in the 1950s. But if you ever happen to be 4 hours south of here in Marshall, Illinois, stop by our library. We wanted to redo our children's area and make it extra special. And our community loves history. If we do a history program, it'll bring them in. So we decided to build a replica of this train station in our children's area. So we worked with a local artist who runs the art colony, and then a local carpenter who, you can't really see the detail, but every piece of siding on that has that old sort of ornate trim work, and he recreated that inside of our children's area in the library.
You're lucky.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
So this map illustrates the path of a tornado outbreak from 1917, where the tree fell on the tent of the Gypsies were camped in. And overall, 383 people were killed over an 8-day period from May 25th to June 1st. At least 73 tornadoes occurred across the Midwest and southeastern US during this time, with 15 separate events being classified as violent F4 or F5. And it's so interesting to see. You have all of this right across central Illinois, and then it literally jumps the state line at Marshall. And so I really think that's where our legend began about the Gypsy Queen and the tornadoes. And here's a little bit closer look where you can see it's just going right along across the whole entire state, and then it skips over us and picks up again on the other side of the state line. So we do have people who point out that Marshall did have a tornado. In 1947, in April, our high school was hit by a tornado, which again is right on the north edge of town. It took the roof off of the high school and it kept going. Nothing else was touched. And it happened on a Saturday. So there was not a soul in the building. No one was injured. And they were able just to move all of the classes down one floor, and it didn't even stop classes from happening. They just trucked right on. So we're really fortunate in my area to have a lot of oral histories and written memories of people who remember these Romani families visiting the area. And one of the best is an interview with this gentleman, Morgan Newland, who his interview was conducted by a local minister's wife. She was taking a folklore class and she interviewed him. And Morgan was born in 1920, just a little bit south of Marshall in Hudsonville. And he was raised in a little town called West Union. And his father's land was where the families camped when they came to the area. So he recalled these fantastic memories of the travelers, and to have that firsthand, memory was really neat. So he said they would come through in the spring, in April or May, and then again in the late summer in August. And they would always stay 2 or 3 weeks, and they would trade horses and tell fortunes and do just lots of little things. And he said that people really enjoyed having them visit, that they looked forward to trading horses with them. And he has fond memories of playing with the children. And Morgan's mother was an amateur photographer, which was really unusual for the time in the 1920s. And he recalled some photographs that I haven't been able to track down yet, but that's another mission, is to find those family photographs he has of them. And he especially remembered their well-bred horses and their big, colorful wagons. So the map shows where his father's farm was, and this was Morgan's school. And so every day when Morgan had to go to school, he had to traipse through the gypsy camp between home and his school. But the gypsy children didn't have to go to school. They were just raised by their families and homeschooled. So he thought it was terrible that he had to go past all of his friends and go to school when they didn't. He also remembered that they would try to model their parents and make trades. Pocket knives in particular were a favorite item. And so the boys would spend a few days, a week or so, playing pocket knife games, throwing the pocket knives and different things, so that each one kind of thought they knew what sort of pocket knife the other one had. Well, then they would start to trade. And the local boys would think they knew the knives that the traveling children were using, but they didn't realize they had swapped it out. And they might trade for one that had half of a broken handle or a broken blade or something. So they were being a little tricky when the young boys were making those trades. But Morgan recalled that his sister got her revenge one time. One of the gypsy boys, a boy about 13 years old, they all called Punk, wanted to trade chickens with Morgan's sister. She was only about 5 years old at the time. And I guess the wagons had little baskets of chickens that would ride underneath as the wagons were traveling. And the chickens all belonged to the children. They were theirs to raise and trade and sell and do what they wanted to do with. So Punk, as they called him, wanted to make a trade with this little girl. And he kept wanting to trade one of his hens for one of his roosters for one of her hens. And she knew that wasn't a good deal, to trade that rooster for one of her good laying hens. So they kept trying different things back and forth. And he really wanted to make a deal with her. So finally he agreed to trade one of his hens for one of her roosters. So he wasn't getting a really good deal anyway. Well, what he hadn't noticed yet was that her rooster even had a bad eye. So she kind of tricked him in the trade and traded a rooster with a bad eye for one of his good laying hens. And Morgan was especially close with the younger man in the photo here, who was named Ollie, and he was one of Matt and Amanda Cooper's grandsons. And in the interview, Matt talks about, how Ollie would still come to visit him. Even as they got older and the family settled down, Ollie's family would go to Florida. And Morgan said, 1 year he just stopped coming. Well, I did some research and found out that he had passed away about that time. And I don't think Morgan ever knew that. He just wondered why his friends stopped visiting. But one of my favorite stories, Morgan recalled one incident with a young newlywed gypsy couple who were having quite a quarrel. So they're at their camp and they're newlywed. So they have their little wagon and they have a little stove in the middle of their camp. They didn't have a whole lot else. They were just starting out. And Morgan and his dad are out plowing the field. So they've got their horse, they're plowing, and they hear this noise over at the camp. And that little young gypsy woman is chasing that man around, throwing everything she can reach at him, the pots, the pans, anything she can grab. And Morgan and his dad stop. And they're kind of rooting for this little stove. He said it was kind of funny. They're like, that little stove can make it. They won't knock it over. Well, it did survive. But they went to camp later that night and said, what was going on? Why were they having such a fit? Well, the families are so close and they're so protective of each other. Nobody would say a word about what happened. So years later, Morgan asked Ollie about it. And Ollie said, well, they were newlyweds. And he had gone out trading that day with the older men. And he came back with lipstick on his collar, and she didn't wear lipstick. Oh. So she was pretty upset with him. And I had posted an early version of this on YouTube, and one of the people that watched it was a granddaughter of that couple. And she said, that was my grandparents. And so that was really neat to connect with her. And just for fun, these are a few more pictures of the Cooper family. This is Dinah Cooper Jeffrey, and she is not buried in our local cemetery, but I just love that picture of her. And then Stanley Cooper. And Stanley is buried at Marshall, and he was one of the later kings of their clan. And an interesting local record, the family was camped just south of Marshall in Robinson, Illinois, when Stanley had to register for it was the World War II draft. And so they asked, do you have any dependents? And he said, yes, my mother and father are dependent on me. But then the recorder made a note that said parents are supposed to be well-to-do. They are traveling gypsies. Another local who remembered the Cooper family was Basil Moore, and he was the local funeral home director. So he handled a lot of arrangements for the Cooper family, and he remembered them very fondly. And he's the one that presided over an election once. They needed, before the family left from the funeral, they needed to have their new king and queen in place, and they asked Basil to be their officiant in that election. And at one time, he took a group of gypsy men to the local elementary school. And he wrote later that he didn't know who enjoyed it more, the children getting to meet these traveling people who had such exciting stories to tell, or the men who were able to meet the children and share their stories. And then we also had another local resident, Dan Reedy, who wrote a book called Growing Up on Big Crick. And each chapter was sort of a different theme. And so in one of them, he has a chapter about the Gypsies. And by the time he remembered it in the 1950s, though, the family camped closer to town, just outside this little motel that used to be there, the East Marshall Motel. And he said, by that time, Buicks, Lincolns, and Cadillacs provided the horsepower, and the large house trailers replaced their bow-top wagons. An interesting note that he made in his book was that the elder, more respected of the group, always got to choose their camp location first, so that they could choose locations nearest the road. So when you had visitors come to the camp wanting to trade or make a deal, those elders had first shot at making that money or getting that deal. And of course, modernization and World War II in particular changed their lifestyles. The traveling families started to settle down. Our local historical society put a county history book together in 2019, and one of the genealogists interviewed a member of the Cooper family and said that they are still involved with horses, though, that there are many of them who are raising and training thoroughbreds in Kentucky, Tennessee, and down into Florida. And our town has just really embraced the idea of the Gypsy Queen. This logo here, the Gypsy Queen Coffee, is a new little coffee shop that opened downtown. They just celebrated their first anniversary. And then in 2016, we had the Wall Dogs. They're a group of internationalist muralists who come from all over the world to paint murals. And we had a 4-day festival, and they painted 24 or 25 murals all over our town. And this was one of them, featuring our Gypsy Queen. And then in our children's area, when you go inside that replica of the train station, this is a mural that's painted on the back wall. And it was set to look like you are inside the train station. But the little girl looking out the window is looking towards where the families would have camped. So there are some gypsy wagons painted there. So we've just tried really hard to keep this history alive. And that's what sparked it for me. We had so many people coming in the library asking questions, and there was so much misinformation out there. And I wanted the library to tell the authentic, the true story. And that's what really had sparked this interest for me. Okay, any questions or comments?
So what about modern day gypsies or travelers?
Travelers.
Because a friend of mine, she lives in farm country in DeKalb County, and she said they come through and they paint the barns.
Yes.
That's what she told me.
And there's a lot of the families, they still do a lot of mobile work where they can be on the go. Another really big thing with the families is concrete work, like putting in septic systems or servicing septic systems and doing driveway paving. So those sort of things where they can still be mobile. There was a study in the 1960s or 1970s, a woman who was getting her PhD, I don't know, in psychology, something like that, out in California. And she tried really hard to get very close to a family out there. And they're still just so tight that it's really hard to, from what I understand, really hard to get to know some of the families. Now, when they had the mural painters in Marshall, some of the Cooper family members came back. They actually had a family reunion in town while the mural was being painted of their ancestor, which was super cool. And they were interviewed by the local newspaper, and they didn't really know a lot about their heritage. She just said, you know, we're good Christian people. I think there's still sort of a stigma around it, that they were a little bit afraid of being pegged, you know.
And would the kids today still be allowed to be home? Well, I guess they could.
They could be
Now that's very well
homeschooled.
established
Absolutely.
homeschooling now.
Absolutely. Yeah, they could definitely be homeschooled.
Let me get people at home to maybe,
We have
put
questions.
questions in the chat.
Do you guys have any questions?
Maybe, I don't know if you did describe exactly where Marshall is, because I've been to Marshall now several times. I was there in the about 20 years ago when you had a Smithsonian exhibit.
Yes.
So it's like you're south of Champaign.
We are almost straight down south of Chicago, just straight south. Interstate 70 cuts across kind of the middle of the state there. And we are where Interstate 70 and Route 1 connect.
Route 1 is that one that traces the
Hubbard Trail.
Illinois
Yeah.
with Indiana border.
Yes. So we're about 15 minutes from the Indiana border. So about 4.5 hours south and 15 minutes from the Indiana border. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. That's us.
Yeah, no, it's a great place. And both times that I have come to Marshall, I also went to that town of 1 or 2 people that serves the hamburgers.
Moonshine. They call them moon burgers. And it is literally in the middle of nowhere. I have lived in Marshall my entire life, and I still have to look at directions before I go because it started a little town called Moonshine in what was their general store. So it was just a little community, middle of nowhere, half dozen families with this general store. Well, in the 1950s, life was really changing and a lot of women were finding work out of the home. And so the farmers couldn't go home for lunch. They started going to the little general store just to have somebody to talk to. And the owner's wife started flipping hamburgers. And it wasn't long before they found they were making more money serving lunch than they were selling groceries. So now they are famous. They've been on CBS this morning.
Yep.
Yeah.
And actually, they've kind of retired.
They have.
And it's their family that's continuing the tradition.
It is.
But it's a really, really very good hamburger. And
they shut the grill off at 12:30. So if you're not there by 12:30, don't even bother stopping because it's not going to happen.
That's right. And I think they start like 5:30.
I was thinking 5:30 or 6.
Yeah. It's like, and I saw the CBS this morning. And I was on the phone with a friend. We were scheming how he got there. I'm not sure he's ever gotten there, but I've been there several times.
Yeah, it is a neat place.
Motorcycles.
Yeah.
People with their, hobby cars.
Yep.
It's a great time.
It
but
is.
Marshall itself is a very nice town.
It is. It is a neat little town. We are actually hosting a Smithsonian exhibit right now through the Illinois Humanities. It's actually the 5th for our community, and which is more than I think any other community in the state.
Which one? So, what's the theme?
We have the Spark Places of Innovation.
Okay, because there's another one that's coming to DeKalb County.
Okay.
But I think it's a different theme.
Okay.
I think, but I'm not sure.
I'll have to look for it. Yes.
Yeah.
Cool.
Any
questions?
I know we annoyed you all with the pictures. That I'm really sorry about. But if there's questions, we got them.
Well, I just want to say that it was really fascinating, and I loved how you had like the maps and the photography and
Thank
like,
you.
the people and the cemeteries, and like this is something I don't know anything about, but I feel like even in this short time, like you just airdropped us
Thank
into
you.
the subject in a really interesting way.
When I first started presenting it, I was a little bit concerned because it is so focused on our area, but it is so fascinating. I've presented it all across the state and everyone seems to really enjoy it. So.
Did you explain the capital G Gypsy and the small G Gypsy?
I did.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yes,
that was my fault.
That was at the very beginning and I did it about 4 times. We got that.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
There's some concern when I started. So you see from our community with the Gypsy Queen coffee and the mural that our community has embraced the term gypsy, but there is sometimes a little bit of a negative connotation with it. And so when I was first really hardcore doing my research, I reached out to a gentleman on Ancestry who I was trying to unravel that whole Valley Harrison situation where the daughter married the man with the same name as her father, but he doesn't fit anywhere in the family. I don't know. And I emailed this man through Ancestry and was asking him some questions. And I didn't realize he was like the guy. He's part of the Traveler Society in England. He's written 2 books on traveling families. And I don't think I'd have had the courage to reach out to him if I'd have known who he was, but we had this wonderful
Ignorance is
conversation.
bliss,
It
right?
is. So for several weeks, we went back and forth, and I was able to provide him some information when I went to Evansville, got some records that he didn't have. So it really was just a lovely conversation. But I asked him, is it okay if I use this term? And he was the one that really explained that as long as it's used respectfully, capitalized to denote that they are an ethnic group, then it is absolutely acceptable.
And when it's small g.
It can be a little derogatory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, because I would never want to do anything to offend or upset.
No,
I think their
never
history is
knowing.
fascinating. I wish I had a gypsy in my family. I would be all over that. But they are farmers going back 200 years in the same county. So
Well, there is somebody in our audience today who is of gypsy lineage.
that's awesome.
Yes,
Very cool.
if they wish to say something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope I didn't say anything
Kathy, do you want me to say something?
Yeah, why not?
So, the question of where are the Romani now, we're everywhere. We're intermarried. And there are also encampments. So, but people that have been intermarried are often, I was always told from my family who are Romani in England, don't tell anybody. I was told by my mother, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. So it's a secret. There's always hints, names like Cooper and Smith, because of the restrictions in the Byzantine Empire and Wallachia, Moldavia, where, like the Jews, they could only practice certain professions and smithing and also the traveling profession. So yeah, Romani are everywhere. In 1980, and I was not in Chicago, I was in Michigan then, there were 70 people that claimed Romani heritage as in the census. However, it's known the number is much larger, and people don't always identify themselves because of the stigma.
Thank you.
So there.
Do you consider yourself, do you identify as Romani?
No, I'm so many other things. I'm a quarter Romani, and I'm American.
That's excellent answer.
I love that.
Excellent answer. Yeah, that was, Nancy's the archivist here, and we discussed, when we were discussing whether or not to invite you, and she goes, well, I have Romani. I was like, well, that's
Oh, that's amazing. I love it.
that makes it.
I'm
worthwhile.
jealous.
Don't be jealous. Everyone goes around trying to pretend they're not.
Yeah.
Even now in London, and my cousins.
Well, I think if there's any more questions or comments. Oh, I think, wait. If there's anybody, does anybody want to hold their hand up and they have a question, I can unmute you, just in case.
And I can go back through any pictures that you guys didn't get to see if
Oh,
there's
we're
anything
definitely
you
gonna
want to
do
see.
that for a few minutes. No, I think we're good.
Okay,
So thank you
thank
very
you.
much. The trip was worthwhile.
Yes,
And we had at least 25 people connected, which means there's even more.
fantastic.
All righty.
Well-
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Nancy.